If I were to ask you to describe Victorian in one word, what would you think? You might say trains, automobiles, Christmas, Charles Dickens, bustles, hoop skirts, and center-fronted hairstyles. And you would be right. The Victorian era is a very long period of history. It's during the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901. And that's a long time to reign. And that's also a really long time of fashion to change. Since period dramas are starting to become more common, for example, the historical influence of Bridgerton, Persuasion coming out, and Emma coming out, and a few other period dramas like Little Women, which I'm not going to discuss here. Since all of these styles and fashions are coming into more mainstream media, I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at what really was worn during the time period. The Victorian style of fashion is actually quite unique because it takes a lot of influence and artistic creation, designs, and elements from the 18th century. In this video, I want to focus on the early portion of Queen Victoria's reign in the late 1830s to 1840s and all the way to the late 1860s, because it's by the 1870s where fashions are totally changing. And instead of the skirts becoming smaller and larger and smaller and larger, by the 1870s, the skirts for the most part are slimming down and are staying smaller, with a few little trends popping up here and there, but for the most part, small skirts and tapered skirts and gathered gored skirts are here to stay. But in the 1840s and 1850s and 60s, large skirts were really getting popular. So in this video, we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about these changes to help you in your sewing journey to notice these little details that are implemented in these little styles of fashion that may not be quite noticeable for most people. On my Instagram, I had asked you guys just some basic questions. So for the 1840s, the majority of the answers were sloped and rounded shoulders, pointed bodices, and V-neck shaped bodice features, including ruching and gathering was popular, as well as the V neckline. Just like today, fashions are sometimes influenced significantly by someone who has a lot of notoriety or recognition by the public. The style and fashion of the time was very flamboyant and garish. Victoria did not like this style. Instead, opted for more modest and simple looking dresses in her eyes. And that style actually became popularized during the 1840s. In this example from 1838, one of the key features of the 1840s, thanks to Victoria, was the V neckline. There are gathers at the very front of the bodice. And these pleated gathers become much more exaggerated as the decade goes on. And the skirt has pleats going around the bodice, except for at the back, there are cartridge pleats, which is another thing very specific to the 1840s. The 1840s style has a lot of cartridge pleating and a lot of gathering. The bodices are longer, going a little bit longer than the natural waist. The sleeves are also a little different. In the 1830s, the sleeves were very large and full from the shoulders all the way to the wrist. But here, the biceps are more fitted and the sleeves below the elbow are rather full. The 40s really liked adding a little bit something extra to the sleeves. Instead of having something simple and plain on the fitted portion of the sleeve, they had a tendency to add a little bit of embellishments or a little bit of detail. In this example in particular, it looks like there's some ruffles in the back as well as being totally encompassed by pin tucks. My next example is from 1840. And the style you can see is actually pretty similar to the 1830s. However, there are a few key differences. The skirt itself doesn't have any pleating in it. It is totally cartridge pleated. The bodice itself looks like it's a very pointed front with gathering stitches basted down to the very front, and the gathers itself being loose and full above the bust line. And this bodice style in particular is very, very popular in the 1840s. Ruffling detail on the fitted part of the sleeves, and the sleeves themselves are actually rather large. 1840 and 1838 are relatively similar styles. By the time we get to the 1850s, there are some significant changes that have already occurred and have been implemented. At the end of the 1840s, the crinoline cage or hoop skirt has just been developed. Out goes all of those 4 layers of thick petticoats filling out the skirts, and now you really only need to use 1 or 2 to smooth out the rings. Crinoline hoops had become the rage. Everyone was wearing them. It was very uncommon for somebody to not wear them. They were affordable at any price range and accessible pretty much everywhere. By the time the 1850s comes around, that influence of Rococo revival has started up. You can see that in the prints and the kinds of fabrics, appliques, and embroidery on the dresses as well. And plaid, which had started to gain popularity in the 1840s, was in full swing. Plaid dresses and plaid day wear, even plaid evening gowns, was all the rage in any color and any style and any size. Now that the skirts were fuller and more vibrant with color and lots of different kinds of prints and patterns, it's become a little bit more gaudy than just a few years prior. Although the 1850s and 1840s still have some similarities, for the most part it was moving in a completely different direction. For example, the fitted sleeves that had been totally fitted by the end of the 1840s was relatively gone. There were more sleeve styles and varieties by the 1850s, including the pagoda sleeve, which was incredibly popular. By creating a rather large triangular shape here, it can draw the eye to the largeness of the shoulders and the hips, and to the smallest point of the waist. There was a higher neckline, and the V-neck was just not in style anymore. However, the V and conical shape of the bodices were very popular still. The 1850s used a circular crinoline. The waistline has moved to just at the waistline. The key elements of this dress that makes it stand out in comparison to 1860s is specifically the tiered skirt. By the 1860s, the tiered skirts and overall any kind of elaborate trimmings on the skirt was completely gone. By the early 1860s, the style of dresses had sort of reached their upcoming pinnacle of largeness. So instead of the skirts being completely bell-shaped, they started to become a little bit more circular, and then towards the end of the decade became much more elliptical, with a majority of the gathering and volume of skirt in the back of the dress. This dress that I'm wearing is specifically 1861, and I have here the pagoda sleeves. It's all monocolored, it's got a high neck, and it's very simply designed. There isn't a whole lot of detail at all involved, and it's very modest. Another thing that became very popular in the late 1850s all the way through the 1860s, even into the 1870s, were creating 2 different styles of bodices for one skirt, being a day bodice. The second was an evening bodice, something to be worn for dinner, for balls, or something for a more formal occasion. The dresses from 1860 to 1862 were relatively monotoned and not a whole lot of detail added to them. But really, by the end of 1863, all the way through 1867, geometric patterns and designs and bringing back the lavish trims were becoming very popular again. In conclusion, the key takeaways of determining which dress came from which decade is as follows. Does it have a V-neck? Does it have a much longer bodice? Is there a hoop skirt? Are there pagoda sleeves and are there tiers? Does the hoop skirt focus more volume to the back of the dress? Is it monotoned? Is it really simple? Or does it have any kind of embellishments and details to it? So just by asking those questions, I hope you'll be able to determine which era of costume that you're wanting to create. Well, I believe that does it. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.